Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
I think if we rewind to that little kid who we're trying to teach to check in with somebody, we rewind to that moment where we're trying to teach our boys that women are human beings.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
G'day, this is Dr. Justin Coulson. I'm the author of 6 books about making families happy and the founder of happyfamilies.com.au. And I'm here with my beautiful wife, Kylie, co-host of the podcast and mum to our 6 kids. Kylie, a follow-on from our last conversation with Professor Megan Maas. Really excited for our discussion today.
I've heard a lot of people talk about sex education and specifically at the moment in media about consent education.
Yeah, so last week we were talking with Megan about adolescents and their consumption and exposure to pornography. So today, because we didn't get it in last week, we figured we'd talk consent. Oh, by the way, before we go too far, I need to highlight today's podcast contains mature themes that include topics around sex, consent, pornography, and other associated issues. While the podcast is not rated explicit, the content may not be suitable for some people. Actually, before you dive in, because I know you've got some questions about this, I just want to highlight something that seems really obvious to me. And that is that kids know what consent is. So the big petition from Chanel Contos, which I just applaud her courage. I don't have anything negative to say about what she's done here, except for this idea that kids need consent education. I reckon some probably do, but as a rule, kids know what's right and wrong. Kids know when somebody is consenting and when somebody is not. And teenagers at a party, They understand. Like, they sat in the same classroom with their, let's say a boy. He's sitting right next to the girl that now he's putting pressure on to do something non-consensually. They know what consent is. So I think that we've got to kind of have a talk about that. But anyway, you're pretty excited about this conversation as well. So what were your questions for Megan? And we'll explore my concerns as well.
Well, we're having this conversation around consent education and, it needs to start early and it doesn't actually need to have anything to do with sex. But, as you were talking, I'm thinking about self-control. We need to help our kids have self-control, I think. Megan, what do you think about this idea? Consent education, sex education, does it happen in our homes? Is it supposed to happen in the school classroom? How do we help our children navigate this really, really scary space that we're dealing with?
Yeah, so it is complicated in ways that, every high school, every school, group of friends has its own little climate and culture, what we call social norms, what's right and what's wrong, what gets away with, what people can get away with, what people can't get away with, their own kind of policing within each other. And I think there is a certain, amount of teens know what consent is. But the entitlement to girls and the way that their girls can be disrespected in this sort of school environment is what needs to be addressed, right? I mean, consent education is great, and you can begin those lessons really young. I mean, you can talk about, like, one of the things I do with my younger children is we talk about checking in to make sure everybody's still having fun. Because a lot of times they have these make-believe games and then they don't like that they have to be a certain character or their character got, blown up or moved off the island or something. And so you have to check in. Is so-and-so still having fun? And they'll find out, oh no, so-and-so isn't having fun anymore. So maybe we should play something different or figure something else out. And then eventually, applying that to your romantic relationship experiences. I've always been confused as a researcher as to why the golden rule doesn't get applied to romance and sex. Why, treating others the way you would like to be treated somehow goes out the door when romantic sexual experiences are involved. So I think it's a combination of parents talking to kids about consent, but also, having those conversations where they're not blaming so-and-so for being sexually assaulted. I think as parents, if we comment on, so-and-so's behavior, or what was she doing, or what was she thinking, that can send a message to our sons and our sons' friends that it's okay to disrespect someone that way, or it's okay, she was asking for it. And that changes, the climate or the current sort of culture in that school that would permit, sexual violence to go on.
So Megan, I grew up in a home where these kinds of conversations were had openly, and Justin and I have continued that within our own home, and we've always seen and felt like these kinds of conversations are conversations that as parents we need to be having our children. Obviously, with the climate that's we're sitting in now in Australia in particular, there is this huge push for consent education in our schools, and for many years now, sex education has actually been part of the curriculum. But, is this up to parents, or is this up to the schools? Where do we stand with this? And if there is a need for this to happen in our school system, how do we have a collaborative approach so that we actually can safeguard our kids?
Right. So, where schools come in is that we have to have safe environments for our kids to learn in. And so let's say for girls, for example, if she's getting teased because she's not wearing makeup, or she's getting teased because she's wearing too much makeup, or you can see her bra strap, or you can see her underwear, or whatever. And let's say a boy's making fun of her. And if a teacher doesn't then turn that boy in, like if there isn't a consequence for that kind of harassment, then that's going to feed a school climate that's going to be inducive of more sexual harassment, and which research shows is then more sexual violence. And so schools do play a certain role in being able to, or needing to sort of assess what the climate is in terms of gender relations, and how safe do girls feel, at school to not go to school in makeup or in, a certain outfit, or be able to raise their hands and get the answers wrong without being teased. That kind of stuff very much, teachers need to be involved, and there does need to be a certain amount of programming, or at least discussion of this kinds of behavior isn't going to be tolerated. But when it comes to, sexual consent and identifying what your values are and your boundaries are in terms of kissing, touching, hugging, holding hands, or engaging in sexual behavior without clothes on and things like that, all of those kinds of conversations, hopefully you can guide as a parent and help connect, youth with books and things like that. Those kinds of conversations and educational techniques are tough to do in a school setting because it's embarrassing, and no child is going to want to sort of brainstorm what their sexual values are in a school setting. So we would hope is happening more at home, but the schools do play a role in that, in the sexual violent climate, essentially, is what academics call it. And so there does need to be a certain amount of education and boundaries at the school level in terms of what is and what's not going to be tolerated. Yeah,
it is a bit of both, unfortunately. I'm thinking about culture. And there's an old definition of culture that's been around for a long, long time. That is that culture is the collective behavior of the group. It's what everyone does. But recently I was listening to Adam Grant on a podcast. He was talking with a culture expert who redefined culture in a really powerful way for me. This person said, you define culture by the worst behavior that is allowed.
Oh.
That is, when people are allowed to do something and it goes, I guess, unpunished, there's a level of acceptance for it, that is what becomes the culture. And in this consent conversation, I think that's a perfect description of what's going on. A certain level of behavior has been allowed for far too long, and it's way too far below our community standards to be acceptable, and yet it has been allowed. We're going to come back after the break and have a talk about what we can do about turning that culture around, particularly when it comes to what has become a really painful, for me at least, and maybe even unhealthy conversation about boys and masculinity. That's up next.
It's the Happy Families Podcast.
For a happier family, try a Happy Families membership, because a happy family doesn't just happen. Details at happyfamilies.com.au.
It's the Happy Families Podcast, the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. We are talking with Assistant Professor Megan Maas.
Megan is from Michigan State University and researches in adolescent sexuality and all things around kids, pornography, sex, consent, and all of these sensitive issues that are so topical right now in Australia.
It's hard to have these kinds of conversations, Megan, without there being, I guess, a negative connotation around boys and masculinity. Can we just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we need to address the unhealthy aspects of masculinity and then embrace the healthy ones. It's not that masculinity is bad. I think masculinity's gotten a bad rap because of the toxic, unhealthy types, which is being hostile. So, being violent is considered more of a masculine trait than feminine, and being sort of controlling and that kind of thing. Is not healthy, but, wanting to protect, that's a great quality to have. And, feeling like you want to do the right thing or take care of somebody, that can be a good quality, and that can help in these kinds of situations. And I do think we need to give boys who are doing those kinds of things more credit.
I guess the last question that I would have for you, Megan, is the consent conversation is breathtakingly complicated. And I'll give you an example. It's Tuesday, the 2nd of whatever month it is, and a girl sends a text message to a boy. She's probably not sending a text message. She's probably using Snapchat, or she's using Instagram, or whatever it is. But she sends some sort of an instant message to a boy, and it's pretty flirty. And over the next 3 or 4 weeks, they flirt backwards and forwards over their instant messaging service, and they become increasingly provocative and increasingly bold in the things that they're saying to each other. And she's kind of saying, hey, that party that's coming up on the 28th, I'm going to be there. And I plan on being there with you. And he's getting really excited, and he's talking to all his mates about it, and she's talking to all of her girlfriends about it. And then the party arrives on the 28th. I'm assuming it's a weekend. I haven't done the maths, but you get the idea. They show up at the party, and there's alcohol there, and she's consuming a whole lot of alcohol, and he's getting pretty well blotto as well. And sometime around about 11:30 at night, once everybody's sort of really, really drunk and really, really partying, and the music's blaring, and the boys have been saying, come on, man, you got to do it. You got to do it. And the girls are saying, do you really like him? I think he's really into you. You said that you're really into him. And there's all this pressure from the friends. And next thing you know, they end up in a bedroom together. Maybe they've not just had alcohol. Maybe there's been some cannabis, or maybe there's been some pills that they've popped. So there's a whole lot of drugs and alcohol mixing in with a whole lot of pressure from friends, mixing in with a whole lot of sexual tension that's built up over the last 4 or 5 weeks of instant messaging and saying to each other, you turn me on so much. Now they're in the bedroom together, and he starts to make his move. And in that moment, she freezes. She panics. She says, I don't think I'm ready for this. In that state, and I'm not defending a boy here for doing the wrong thing, but in that state, I think any rational adult can see that this is going to be a confusing moment where something could go very wrong.
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, anytime, this is where it is really tough, because as soon as drugs and alcohol are involved, which they are in 80% of sexual violence cases, but, alcohol can also be a part of a consensual sex, among married people. I mean, I think it does us a disservice to say that if there's, one drink is had, then it's non-consensual sex. That means, almost everybody has been a rape victim then. And that's certainly not the case. So there's some research that's trying to get at what blood alcohol level can you really consent or what have you. But I think if we focus back, if we rewind to that little kid who we're trying to teach to check in with somebody, we rewind to that moment where we're trying to teach our boys that women are human beings who do want to have sex, who have sexual feelings, who are entitled to safety and are entitled to pleasure, that they're human beings. They're not just these pretty objects where you need to work really hard to sort of own or consume or be her first or whatever, making the human out of it, really focusing on the humanity of it all, I think can prevent situations like that from happening in the first place, and could perhaps socialize people so much that even if they are drunk or even if they are high, those tendencies to be a decent human being and to check in with each other and to be loving and to go slow and to not give a flying whatever about what their friends think, those situations are going to be less confusing. That's what we would hope.
Megan, this has been such a valuable contribution to what is an ongoing conversation in Australia and around the world about this topic. Kylie, take-home message.
Consent conversations need to start young with our kids, hugs, tickles, friends, family. I think it's really important that we empower our children to, be able to make decisions around what feels right to them. But consent's also a really complicated conversation. There is so much involved in it, and we need to, really be able to work through that with our children.
It is complicated, and yet in the same breath, it's so simple. Treat other people nicely. Be civil. Like it's actually that simple, and yet it is so complex. Anything else?
And I think it's really important. We've been talking about how there's just so much negative talk around boys in particular and masculinity, and it's important for us to kind of point out the good, because there is so much good. I grew up, my memories of the boys that I hung out with, they were good boys and they treated me with respect. I don't really have any negative experiences from my 40 plus years of life of dealing with men. They have been respectful and have treated me with, love and kindness and compassion. And we need our girls to know that not everyone is bad.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you said that, especially since you're married to me. We hope that you've enjoyed the podcast. Megan, it's been a delight to have you on. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and expertise.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always fun to talk with you.
The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media, and our executive producer is Craig Bruce. If you'd like more info about consent, you can visit happyfamilies.com.au. A whole lot more info coming up there with some of the work that I'm doing on this particular topic. And of course, to stay in touch with making your family happier, you can get all the info about our Happy Families memberships also at happyfamilies.com.au.